Thank you. And it's great to be here. It's nice to be back in Australia on Australian time. I got back a couple of weeks ago, so I've had some time to get over my jet lag, which is also nice. I've been looking forward to doing this part two webinar, and we're going to cover off quite a lot today. Just before I get into it and get into processing and how I'm going to use Nik to sort of optimize some images, I just want to go over a few things that I touched on briefly in part one. And I guess the first and most important cornerstone of this is that whenever you're processing any of your photographs, you need to be working on a color calibrated display and not just a laptop display, but a high quality photo display. It's really at the cornerstone of everything that we do as photographers. So in my studio in Melbourne, Australia, I'm working on a BenQ SW272U. That's the model number. It's a 4K Adobe RGB display. It's capable of really fantastic color rendering, and it's also got an uh, extremely even luminance across the display. So it's fantastic for what we do. So I don't personally like to work on laptop displays at all, primarily because as you tilt the display, the brightness levels change, and it makes setting white points and black points very, very difficult. So I think as photographers, the very first thing we should do after we buy a digital camera is get ourselves a decent display. So I won't get stuck on that too much because we don't have a huge amount of time, and I really want to get into it. I want to get into some post-production. I'm going to start with a fairly difficult image. So I've got a selection of images on screen at the moment. And we're going to use this particular image of this Arctic fox. Now, this is a image I shot in the far northwest of Iceland in winter during a blizzard. And it looks quite flat, lacking contrast. And that's the raw file. That's the raw file as it came onto the card in the camera and as it came off the card into my computer. If we take a look at the histogram up here on the right-hand side, we can see that the image has been exposed towards the right or biased towards the right-hand side. This is something I also talked about very briefly in part one of this webinar, and it's worth also touching on again. And that is that the way our sensors capture data is non-linear, but your camera's digital sensor, that is. So what that effectively means in practice is that towards the right-hand side of the histogram, the highlight end, you have a much better signal to noise ratio than in the shadows. So that's why if you expose to the right, like I have here, without clipping the highlights, you will get a much better signal to noise ratio than you would if you exposed in the shadows and then had to increase the exposure. So getting exposure right in camera is extremely important. I believe we may now actually have video. So let me just see if I can enable video. Yay, we've got some video. So hopefully you guys can all see me now a little bit as well. That always helps a little bit if you can see someone. So yeah, as I was saying, it's very, very important to expose to the right. Not clip the highlights, but bias your exposure towards the right-hand side. It's one of the core fundamentals of digital photography. It's something I teach on all my workshops, and it really does let you get the best result. Now, as we go along on this journey tonight, if you have any questions, please just pop them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them as we go along. If I miss them, it's just because I'm working in Lightroom and processing, and I'm trying to keep an eye on everything that's going on. So I'll do my very best. But if I miss a question, you can always fire it off to me via email at the end of the night, and I'll do my best to get an answer to you. So let's take this photograph that we've got here that was shot on the Canon EOS R3. It was shot at ISO 6400, so quite high ISO. The reason for that was that the light levels were extremely low. I also wanted a very fast shutter speed because the wind was blowing the snow around very, very much, and I wanted to freeze that snow. If I didn't freeze that snow that was flying around the Fox, it would end up being a white mess, basically, of too much blur. So I experimented a little bit when I was in the field with different shutter speeds, and I found 1600th of a second was about right. The snow was really flying fast. The wind was very, very strong. So the other thing I did when I shot this was I intentionally tilted the camera in the field because I didn't want the horizon to be straight. I wanted this line to be very, very pronounced because that happens to add drama to the photograph. And I'll show you that when I crop this image. I'm just going to answer a question that's just popped up. I don't actually have the histogram showing in my viewfinder when I'm shooting. And the reason for that is I find it two things. I find it distracting. It takes away from what's going on in front of me. But also, I'm an old school photographer and I prefer an optical viewfinder. And I find that in Canon cameras, they have an option in the R1, in the R3. I just got two R1s today. They have an option called optical viewfinder assist, which gives a much more natural looking viewfinder. But when you use that, you can't actually use a live histogram. So no, I shoot an image and then I look at the histogram on the back of the camera. That's how I like to work. So let's take this image over to the develop module in Lightroom. We're going to make a few tweaks to it before we go over to Nik. Now, I've already done those tweaks, but I'm going to reset the image. And you can see here what I've done to the image. It's very much improved on the raw file, but we're going to reset it. And I want to quickly do those tweaks again before we go over to Nik. So for those of you who might have missed part one uh, of the webinar, well, I'll quickly take you through that. I'm not going to go through all the detail again, but I will go through some of it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm very quickly going to set a black point. Just going to do that by holding down the Option key, and I'll drag down the black slider until I get clipping, and you'll be able to see that clipping there. And then I'm going to bring it back up until I just have the tiniest bit of clipping. Now, that may not show very well on video. I don't know how that's going to translate in Zoom and again onto YouTube, but there's a tiny little bit of black clipping there. And I'm going to do the same with the whites. I'm just going to bring the whites up just until they start to clip and then back them off so there's no clipping. And now what we've done effectively with just those two tweaks is significantly increased the contrast in this image. I'm going to drag the highlights all the way down to minus 100 because I want to flatten off the snow again. And then I'll also back the whites back down just until I get really flat looking whites. And I'll show you why I'm going to do that. I'm going to fix that in Nik. Nik has an amazing tool called tonal contrast that really lets us get fantastic texture and tone into our snow and ice. And it's very difficult to achieve that effect here in Lightroom. But if you start with a very flat white, you can get really incredible results. Next thing I'm going to do is just bring up the shadows a little bit. And then what we're going to do is I'll set the white balance. I'm just going to click on my white balance tool. I'm going to click on a very neutral part of the image. So I have my RGB numbers here down the bottom, red, green, and blue. And I can see that they are 91.2, 92, and 98. So fairly close, a little bit bluish, but that's fine. We'll just click there. That's going to warm the image up fairly significantly. And I'm just going to back it back down so just get a tinge of blue. Now I'm just seasoning to taste here. And the reason I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to pull that blue out to get a very white, neutral white. And a technique I like to use to do this is if you send your white balance quite blue, and then you come down to saturation, and this is I'm in the HSL tab down here, and you grab the blue slider, you can then desaturate blue, not luminance, blue, and get a very neutral white. It's a really nice way to make sure that your snow doesn't have a blue tint or a cyan or magenta tint. You can use any of these sliders to remove any sort of tint that might be in your snow and ice. And the human eye is quite susceptible to, if snow and ice don't look neutral, they look wrong, unless you need particularly blue ice or particularly blue snow for some reason. So let's crop this image a little bit. I like to crop in lights out mode. The shortcut key for that is L. And I'm just going to give this a rough crop for the moment, just like that. And we're almost there with the tweaks in Lightroom. We will throw a mask on. So we'll just select subject. Lightroom does an amazing job, as you can see this is the latest version of Lightroom now, of selecting the subject. Now, this is a very easy image for Lightroom to select the subject because it's against a pure white background. I'm going to add a little bit of texture to the fox's fur, about 10 to 12 points of texture. And I'm going to add some contrast because I want to get more contrast into the fox. It's quite flat because of the light and because of the blizzard. So we're going to just pump contrast up. That will push the whites up and the blacks down. Again, just like that. Next thing I'll do is I'll do another mask with a local adjustment just on this part of the fox's face because I want to draw the viewer's eye into the animal's face. One thing that's really important when you're processing your work, it doesn't matter whether you're processing portraits, wildlife, landscape, motorsport, it really doesn't matter. But one of the things that's really important is you've got to have a vision for where you want to go with the image. It's kind of no good just tweaking and twiddling sliders around until you get an effect that you like. You've really got to have a vision that you're trying to work towards. And I think the image, certainly for me, the images when I'm processing that are the most successful, I think, are the ones where I start with a fairly clear vision in my mind of where I want to be and what is it that I'm trying to say about my photograph. What's the story going to be? And what's the feeling I want people to have when they look at it? I think that's really important. So I've put that mask on the fox's face, and I'm just going to increase exposure so that the fox's face is the brightest part of the fox, because that's where I want the eye to go. The human eye is going to naturally go to the brightest part of the fox. So we've done that, we've done a little local adjustment. We need to sharpen this image before we take it over to Nik. So I will just quickly do that. Get rid of the masking tools. We'll come down to sharpening. I talked about this in the prior webinar, but I don't want to spend too much time on this because time is limited. But it's important to understand that the radius, when you are sharpening an image, the first thing is you must be at 100%. Okay, you cannot judge sharpening unless you're at 100%. You can see here now that we are at 100%, there's a lot of fine textural detail in this fox. There's the fine fur of the fox. There's all that blizzard snow that's blowing around. There's a lot going on. So let's just lower the radius because this is a high frequency image, meaning that there's a lot of very fine textural detail here. And the default radius of 1 is a great starting point. And I agree with Adobe that the default should be 1. But in a situation like this, we've got very fine textural detail. We actually want a lower radius. And if you hold down the Option or the Alt key, you can actually judge this on screen pretty accurately. So I'm going to set a radius of 0.7. And then I will hold down the Option key on a Mac or again the Alt on a PC and just increase the amount of sharpening. And that will show me the image in black and white. And the reason it does that is because sharpening is applied to the luminance channel only. It's not having any effect on the color in the image. So that just makes it easier to judge the amount of sharpening when you see the image in black and white. Okay. And then we've applied that globally. So everything in the image is being sharpened, but I only really want to sharpen the fox. So I will just add some masking. And as I bring up the masking, anything that's turning black is no longer being sharpened. So I'll just set that to about here, perhaps around 20. It's close enough. The next thing I want to do, just before we take it over to Nik, is I'm going to denoise this image. Now, it was shot at ISO 6400 on the Canon EOS R3. It was exposed to the right. So there is not a lot of noise in this image, but there is some, and we can clean it up and get a slightly better result. So let's just hit the denoise button and let Lightroom do its thing. Now, this is quite processor intensive. So you need to be aware that if you're operating on a slower machine, this can take some time. On this particular laptop, this is a Mac M1. So I think it says around about 30 seconds. In my experience, it's a little bit quicker than that. But if you're working on an older machine, this can be quite slow. So just be aware of that. Now, it doesn't actually matter where in the signal chain you do this. So in Lightroom, all of these things that we're doing, all of these adjustments here in the develop module are just instructions for how this image is going to look. Lightroom will actually reorder these into the correct order when we export an image. Or in this case, when I've denoised the image, Lightroom has actually created a new DNG or a new RAW file. And it is also applied to that RAW file all those adjustments we already made. So here we have a denoised image, and we can see it's much, much better. There's some sharpening that's been added. It's much, much cleaner, and it's looking really quite good now. And this is what I would say at this point, we are probably 90% of the way there with processing this image. But we can do more, maybe 95%. We can add some icing on the cake to take this to the next level. So the way I like to do that for snow and ice images is to take them over to Nik. Now, I access Nik by going into photo edit in Photoshop. You can access Nik directly. I like to do it through Photoshop. The reason for that for me is that I can then play with the individual layers in Photoshop. If I overdo an effect very easily, I can reduce the opacity. You can also come into Photoshop as a smart object, meaning that you can make multiple adjustments to the image in Nik as a smart object and then go back into Photoshop from Nik do something else, decide you need to change something, go back into Nik again as a smart object and make further adjustments, further tweak those adjustments you already made. So going in as a smart object is quite powerful. It also saves you quite a lot of storage as well, because you're not adding more layers all the time. So that's something to keep in mind. In this case, I haven't done it for the purpose of demonstration. It doesn't really matter. It's just something to be aware of. If, like me, you have many hundreds of thousands of images in your Lightroom library, storage can become an issue. Working with smart objects is actually has a lot of benefits. So we're going to use Nik 7. This is the new Nik 7 collection palette that you can see here on the left-hand side that I'm just running the mouse over now. And there's a lot of different things here. There's a lot of power and a lot of tools. The only one we're going to look at today is color effects. So this is Nik 7 color effects. And the way you access it is either by clicking here, or you can do it through up here in the filter menu as well. The easiest way is actually just to click on Nik color effects, and that will fire up Nik color effects 7. And here we are now in Nik 7 color effects. And this is inside Photoshop still. And on first glance, this can be quite intimidating. There's an awful lot going on here on the screen. So let's just take it from the top. On the left-hand side, we have a whole bunch of filters that I'm just going to scroll down. Many, many filters here to choose from. They are broken up here above into categories. So if this is a little bit too much for you, you can just click on the basic adjustments to see what are the basic adjustment filters. You can see what are imported filters, what are the architecture filters. There's quite a lot here to choose from. What are the landscape filters? That just helps break down those filters into more manageable chunks until you get to know which ones you particularly like. Now you can create your own categories. I've got one here called Snow and Ice, and this has a couple of filters in it that I use on a fairly regular basis. So tonal contrast is, I thought I had tonal contrast in here. I don't, but I'll show you how to get it into a category as well, because that's the filter we're going to play with the most today. Now, we have our main image on screen here at the moment. And at the moment, I'm set to this slider here that slides left and right. This gives me the ability to see before and after. So left will be the before side, right will be the after side. Now, as yet, we've done nothing to this image, so there's no change, so I move this over it. You can set this up in quick compare mode or in a compare mode above and below, depending on how you want to view and compare your images. Personally, I like to work like this. This works for me, just being able to quickly flick this over and see what it is that I've done to the image. Do I like the look of it? You also have you also have opportunity down here to convert your image to a smart object if you didn't come into Photoshop already as a smart object. So Nik's quite powerful like that. This new version, Color Effects, is a lot more powerful than the previous one. And it's also gotten easier to use as well. So a little bit like Lightroom, for those of you who perhaps haven't used Nik before, you have your filters down the left-hand side. You have a histogram here on the right. And as you apply filters, they're going to appear here on the right-hand side. So for example, I'm just going to search for a filter up here. I'm going to search for tonal contrast 0. And that is my preset that I've created. The reason I've created a preset for this, and I'll just click on my preset and you'll see here, it has applied this preset over here. And you'll notice that all the sliders are set to 0. So I want to be able to come in here and I want to click tonal contrast and have all the sliders at 0. I don't want Nik's default tonal contrast. And the reason for that is it's way overcooked. So if I come back to all the Nik filters and we scroll down to tonal contrast, which is here, you can see I've got it favorited. You can actually just click a star on any filter you want to be a favorite filter. I open this up. We've got 3 default options called default, strong, and high pass. Actually, there's also softening. That's new softening that didn't used to be in Nik 6. If I just click default, you'll see that on the right-hand side, it has now applied a tonal contrast filter with all these defaults, 25% highlights, 50% of midtones, 25% of shadows, etc. That might not be what I want. I like to start from 0. So that's why I've created my own preset. So the way you do that, I'll just delete that filter, is you reset your filters to 0. So if you come in and they're all over the place like this at default, just set them all back to 0. You can either type or drag on the sliders. And then you can come down to this button called Save Preset. You can just type in the name of your preset and save it for future reference and just call it up. And that's a huge time saver, being able to work with presets. And like Lightroom, you can export a preset and share it with somebody else. So if you create something that you like and others like, you can actually share that preset, which is kind of cool. So let's just have a look how this filter is going to work. So it's broken up into the three that we're concerned with: the highlights, midtones, and shadows inside tonal contrast. And I'm going to just way overcook these so you can see the effect on screen. So if I grab the shadows slider, we know that's going to primarily affect the darker parts of the image in the fox. So if I just drag that slider way up, you can see what it's doing there. It's adding a lot of contrast, but only in the shadow area. And I'll just go back and forth like that, so hopefully you can see that in the zoom window. This is a very powerful way to add contrast to selective tones in your photograph. It's quite difficult to do this in Lightroom without doing a lot of masking. Uh, Here in Nik, Nik is doing this masking for us. So when I move the shadow slider, it's selecting only the shadows in the image. It's masking out under the hood the midtones and the highlights. So this is a really powerful tool. So in this case, remember I said in Lightroom, I wanted to make the whites really flat. Now I want to restore all that crispness and punch, all that texture and detail in the snow. So I can do that with the highlight slider. Let's just bring up the highlight slider again. We'll overcook it. And you can watch the highlights as they get crisper and more detail starts to appear. Perhaps if I zoom in a little tighter, see if I can actually move the zoom bar out of the way. It won't let me, unfortunately. Maybe I can do it here. There we go. Let's just go into, say, 75%. And we'll just drag over the fox and pay particular attention to the back side of the fox where all this snow is sticking. If I reset this slider and then I drag it up again, you'll see how much of a difference this actually makes. You can also do it by dragging the before and after slider across the image. Now, you do need to be a little bit careful with this because you can very easily end up clipping your highlights here in Nik if you go too far with this slider. So you need to be a little bit judicious with how you use it. But it's a very good way to get texture and tone into your snow and ice. Now, I know the midtones are going to be this area of the fox in here. I want to add a little bit more contrast into that area as well. And also just a little bit more into the shadows, just like that. And we can just slide the before and after over to see the difference. And keep in mind here that we are just putting the icing on the cake. We have already done I think, a pretty good job of processing this image. We are really just trying to take it to the next level and raise it from being a good image to being a great image. And to do that, we want to maximize the detail that's in this snow and ice because that's what this image is about. It's about this flying snow and ice that's sticking to the fox. You can also do a before and after by this checkbox here, just by turning it on and off. So that's the effect before, that's the effect after. You can also see it particularly down here in the fox's tail where it joins the snow. So very, very powerful. You also have different types of contrast you can play with here. Very rarely do I need to go off the standard contrast, but you have high pass, you have fine, and you can just experiment with these and see if there's one that does a better job for your particular image. In an image like this, where we have so much fine textural detail, I may actually use the fine option, which gives me a bit more leeway in the highlights. I can push a little more than perhaps I would otherwise. So it's quite a powerful tool. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here, let's just go back to a little bit zoomed out a bit more, is we are effectively processing the entire image here with these sliders here in tonal contrast, even though they are targeting specific tonal ranges in this image. When I adjust the highlight slider, for example, it's not just affecting the highlights in the snow on the fox's face, it's actually affecting the highlights in the snow in the entire image. And I don't want that. I really only want to affect the fox's the fox itself and that little bit of snow that the fox is sitting on. And the reason for that is I want that to be the emphasis on where people look at the image. I don't want people to be looking at a line in the snow down here on the left-hand side. I'm happy for it to be here leading into the fox, but I don't want to draw people's attention to other parts of the image. And remember when I spoke about having a vision for your photograph when you're processing it? And that's why this is extremely important, is knowing the end result that you're trying to get to. So we've applied these filters, these sliders, to the entire image, but I don't want to affect the entire image. Okay, how do I affect just the fox? Well, there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can click on this little button down here and add a control point. And if you click on the fox, that will drop a control point onto the image. And you can then come over and click on the masking button, this little masking button here, and that will actually show you what's being affected by this control point. And you can resize it to suit the environment you're targeting and move it around as well. So this is extremely powerful. You can also drop multiple control points in. So I can say, okay, well, I need one in there to affect the shadows. I want one in there to affect the back of the fox. Now we're getting pretty close to what I want. Just turn those off again. So now that I've got control over those three areas, targeting the highlights, midtones, and shadows of the fox, I can resize them. I can drag them around. I can also adjust the luminance of them as well. I can do an awful lot. That's one way you can make a local adjustment in Nik, but there are others. So let's just remove those for the moment. We'll delete those control points. And we'll also just remove that warning dialog so we don't get that every single time. That warning dialog, just do we want to delete those adjustments? Yes, we do. Another way you can do this is with what they call the polygon tool. And with this one, you can just simply click around the subject, draw around your subject like this. You don't have to be very precise, and just join them up. And then you can, again, click on the mask, and you can see it's done a damn fine job of finding that subject in the area I selected. So this is also, it's very useful for wildlife, particularly wildlife that is an unusual, all wildlife is an unusual shape, but anytime you have an unusual shape that's difficult to mask off, this is a very good tool to use. So I use it quite a lot. You also have, we'll delete that. You also have the option to do a control line. This is most useful for dealing with horizons, skies and things like that in landscape images. It's not really appropriate in this image, but again, it's there. You can click on the masking tool to see how that's affecting the image as well. And there isn't really a right or a wrong way to apply your local adjustments, whether you choose control points or whether you do it with a polygon tool or a linear tool. It's simply about having a look, in my opinion, at how the mask is looking once you've applied it. So let's just apply that again. I like to see what my masks are doing, so I will drop control points on this fox to cover the areas that I want to have covered. I'm pretty happy with that there. And as you can see, it is blending outside of the fox, but that is also something I actually want because I don't want to create a hard line or hard bright line where my filter ends. It needs to be blended smoothly throughout the image. So we can turn that off. And again, we can just come over with our before and after to see the effect. I'll just zoom in a bit, make it easier for you guys to see the before and after. Again, I don't know how well this translates across Zoom, but hopefully you can see this before and after. And again, it's most easily seen down here in the tail of the fox. And you can experiment with this, of course, on images in your own time, but it's good to be able to see it as well. Once I've done that particular adjustment, and that's the main adjustment that I'll actually use in Nik, is tonal contrast. I find it's the most useful for snow and ice. The biggest sin I see when I'm judging a lot of photography competitions, particularly polar ones, with images from Antarctica or the Arctic, is snow that's very flat and that lacks texture and tone. You need to bring your snow to life, and you need to bring it to life in a realistic way that makes it believable to the viewer. And this is a great tool to do this with. Before Nik came along with this tool, I used to do this in Photoshop. It's quite an arduous process because you need to apply quite a steep S curve in contrast, and then mask off the areas that you don't want to affect in the highlights, midtones, and shadows. This makes it much, much easier because it targets those areas for you, and then you can further target them with the control points or the polygon tool or the linear gradient tool. You also have some sliders up here. You have a basic saturation slider, and you also have underneath that, you have a shadows and highlights slider. Those are sliders that are designed to help protect areas of the image. So as you bring up the shadows slider, it's going to mask off more and more of the shadow areas from being affected. So I rarely find the need to use that tool, but it is there if you need it. You also have an opacity slider if you want to dial down the opacity. Once you've done all of that, you can actually save that as a preset. So I can then call that up in the future. So I could particularly save this as a preset and say, okay, this is my Arctic Fox winter preset in snow. And I want to save it with or without local adjustments. I'll save it without the local adjustments. And I'll save the preset in an active category if I have one. In this case, I'm just in the all Nik, so it won't let me do that. Click save, and I can now call that up as a preset in the future. So that's extremely powerful and is a big time saver as well. Let's just apply the filters now. And what happens when we apply them is that it will process the image and it will render those out as a new layer. So we're now back in Photoshop and we have our tonal contrast layer here. And we'll just zoom in on the fox so you can see a bit better and more clearly what's going on. And we'll just turn that layer on and off. And again, it's a very subtle adjustment, remembering we're really here putting the icing on the cake, the final spit and polish on this image. So there we go. You can see it around the back and the tail of the fox. And I'm now very, very happy with that image. So I will click save and away we go. I could also mask the image off here in Photoshop. I could apply a mask to this layer if I found that I had done too much to this image. The effect is too strong. Of course, I could just drop the opacity, but I can also throw a mask on it, invert that mask, and use a brush tool to brush in where I want that effect to be. That's another way to actually also have a lot of control over what you do and how you apply this effect to your image. So let's just jump back into Lightroom. We'll grab a different image, and I'm going to take this particular image here. This image is actually the same Arctic fox. It was shot in the northwest of Iceland again, sitting on a snow ridge again in blowing snow. I've already done a whole bunch of adjustments to this image here in Lightroom. I'm not going to go through and reset this and do them again because we're short on time. I want to just take the image over to Nik and show you some of the other tools and techniques that you can use to do this, to improve your image. So images here, this is I believe this is the raw file. This is the raw file. So let's go and edit it in Photoshop. Remembering that that's my preference on how I enter Nik. You can get to Nik directly through Lightroom. Now we're in Photoshop and we'll go back into color effects. And that will fire up Nik color effects. Okay, and we'll just put the loop over the fox itself so we can see a little bit what we're doing. And we might actually just zoom out a little bit as well, because I really want to show you a different filter and how and when I use a different filter. So in this particular image, obviously we've got a lot of blizzard, a lot of blowing snow. Contrast is, visibility was not good. So the distant mountains are quite foggy. What if I want to enhance that? How do I go about doing that? Well, Nik has a very cool filter for that. And I've got it saved here in my own group, my own category, and it's called graduated fog. Now they have, again, a number of defaults that you can click on. And all of these defaults, again, can be reset and saved at 0 for a preset. I'm just going to click on the subtle one to begin with. And that has already applied it to the image. So as you can see, I roll it back and forth. You can see that we've got a nice fog over the top. Now, it was foggy, so we're not adding anything here to the image that wasn't already there. All we're doing is enhancing what's already in the raw file. So what I'm going to do in this instance is I've got the ability to shift this fog up and down in the image. So you can control how you want it and how you want that fog to be blended as well. This is a very good way to help simplify a photograph and to help, again, draw the viewer's eye down to the subject because the subject's quite small in this instance. And in this particular image, what I was really wanting to capture was the grandeur of the landscape, the drama of the blizzard, and how small the fox actually was in the frame and how small it is in the landscape. So all of that environmental activity that's going on with the blizzard, with the fog, the flying snow coming off the end of this huge snowdrift here is all very important, and I want to keep all of that. But I do want to use the fog filter just to add a little bit more fog to the top of the image to help soften off these mountains to keep the eye coming down to the fox again. So again, it's about knowing in your head what it is that you're trying to achieve and having a vision for that and how to get there. Of course, you can rotate the fog as well. You can rotate it if you don't want to have it coming down exactly at 90 degrees. You can, of course, tilt it. In this case, I don't need to. I'm just going to season this to taste a little bit with the opacity and the blend. And then you have a drop down up here with different types or different looks you can choose for the fog as well. So again, a little bit of experimentation here is the way to go. And you can just check it with your before and after slider. Very subtle. And subtle is my preference with this sort of thing. I think it's about building up your effects in layers so that you don't try and do a sledgehammer effect in one go. I think it's much more important to sort of chip away at it to get to the end result that you're looking for. And in this case, I just need a very subtle effect of the fog in the top of the mountains, which is what I want. Again, just seasoning that to taste. You have the same option here to protect shadows and highlights if you need to. And this is already a graduated fog, meaning it's starting at the top and coming from the top down. But I can further control that by using the linear gradient tool. Nik calls it the control line, and just drag that down from the top like this. And I can see then, again, by clicking on the mask, which part of the image is actually being affected. So you've got a lot of power here and a lot of control in where you put that fog and how you work with it in your image. Now, you can also stack filters, but you need to be a little bit careful how you go about doing that. So if I just come over here and we go back to filters, let's just close that up and go to all the Nik filters. If I decide that, okay, I'm really happy with that graduated fog, but I also want to add some tonal contrast, so I just come in here and I click on the default tonal contrast, it'll actually wipe out all the work I've done with my graduated fog filter. It's gone. That's quite frustrating. What you need to do is actually come up and hit this little plus button. And that little plus button will then allow you to stack the filters. So if I go back to my history, I can go back to my graduated fog. Back here, because we have a history like we do in Lightroom. So if you do make a mistake, you can go back. Then if I want to go back and now add my tonal contrast, I can go to my filters, go down to tonal contrast and click on the plus icon. And you'll see on the right-hand side, that will then stack the filter. So that means that I can have multiple filters that will then render out into the one layer in Photoshop. And that's why it's a very good idea to come in as a smart object, because if you have multiple filters being applied in the single layer of Photoshop and you decide, hang on a second, I need to make an adjustment just to the tonal contrast, you can do that by coming back into Nik as a smart object. You cannot do that if you haven't come in as a smart object. Any adjustment you make to the layer in Photoshop will be made to every single other filter that was being used in Nik at the time. So just keep that in mind. Something to be aware of. It can be a bit frustrating. You'll only do it a few times, I promise, before you learn to hit the plus button. So I'm just going to reset my tonal contrast to 0. So I've got a 0 starting point, and then I can actually start to apply the effect again. I will put some in the highlights, some into the midtones. That's going to help the water. And I'm going to actually go a little bit negative in the shadows. Again, I don't want to draw too much attention to these mountains in the background. I really want the emphasis to be on the snow and on the fox. And again, I've just got the ability to go across here. In fact, let's just zoom in so you can see really well how powerful an effect this is. Pay attention to the snowdrift. That's this area here. I'll just increase the highlights a bit again so you can see this really dramatically. So you can see that's your before and that's your after. So you're getting a lot more texture and tone into your snow and ice. And that helps bring the image to life and will make it really, really pop. And it's just a great way to draw people into the snow and ice and help give a feeling of the cold and the drama that's going on in your photographs. Now you can add you can just keep adding filters. I don't know what the limit is on filters here in Nik, but I believe it's quite a lot. So you can add an awful lot of filters. And each set of filters that you add, or each filter, can have its own local adjustments. So for example, if I want all this texture and tone just down here in the snow and ice, not up here, I can do it again with control points just here. I can just drop control points in the area I want, and I can again just click on the mask to see the areas that are being affected. So it's an extremely powerful tool to bring those images to life. And all we've done so far is we've really only looked at two filters. We looked at tonal contrast and graduated fog. But if we go back to all the filters in Nik, you can see that there's actually a great many here that you can choose from. Now, depending on the style and type of photography that you do, you'll find some filters more useful than others. There are a couple of others in here that are well worth looking at. Let's just exit out of this. I'm going to cancel without saving. Yes, we'll lose our changes. That's okay. Because what I want to do is I want to grab one more image while we've got some time and show you another very cool filter that you can use, particularly for wildlife, but also for portraiture as well. We'll take this image of the Pallas cat. Again, I've made some adjustments to it here in Lightroom. We don't need to go through those. That's going to take quite some time. We'll take the image straight over to Photoshop. There are quite a few questions that have popped up in the chat. I will do my best to get to those very shortly. Just bear with me on those. I really want to get into the last of these filters while we've got time. So we'll go back into color effects. Okay, let's just center ourselves up here on this lovely Pallas cat. This was shot in Mongolia in winter. It's of a fairly young male Pallas cat in the eastern steppe region of Mongolia. These are beautiful cats. They are one of only very few cats that actually have a round pupil. So that's how you can always tell a Pallas cat. Just look at the eyes and see that the pupil is round. So that filter I wanted to talk about is a filter that's called Reflector Effects. And it's a really cool tool. And it's something that I used to do back in the studio days. Whenever we wanted to throw a little light on a subject, we'd pull out a reflector, gold or silver or white, and we'd hold it under the subject with a light thrown on the reflector and reflect light back onto the subject. Well, you can do that digitally now. So in a case like this, let's say I wanted to throw a little more light on the subject's face and particularly in its under its chin, I could come down here. I've got three options. I've got a gold, I've got a soft gold, and I've got a silver. I think the silver is going to be the most effective. And again, we'll click on that. But at default, it's too much. You can see at default, there's a, excuse me, setting of 50% on intensity and 50% on fall off and 50% on position. Let's just reset them to 0, which means that the image is now as it was when it came in to Nik. And then we can increase the intensity till I get the effect I want and how the light falls off and also where the light is positioned. But keep in mind, I can also position the light using a control point. So I can just drop a control point under here to throw light just under the chin. That's a very subtle adjustment. Let me just bring it up a bit more so you guys can really see it. Still pretty subtle, but it's nice. I like the way that's just bringing up a little bit more light underneath the cat. Again, hopefully you can see that on the Zoom video. But if not, you can just experiment with that a little bit on images at home. It doesn't need to be a wildlife image. You can do it with portraiture as well. Works very well in photos of people. You also have, of course, source direction up here. That just determines from which direction is that reflected light coming onto the subject. But this is a very good tool to use, particularly if you have images shot in backlight, where you have deliberately placed the subject in front of the sun, and the subject is going to be very underexposed because you're having to expose for the bright highlights around the subject. Using reflector effects can really help bring back up some light onto the subject. You need to season to taste. You need to be a little bit careful that you don't overdo the effect. It's always about maintaining a very natural look. And again, it's putting the final icing on the cake. I think all of the image that you do in Lightroom really should get the image most of the way there. Certainly 90 to 95% of the way there for me. And then it's just the final spit and polish here. So just keep in mind again, if you've developed a look that you like, you can again save it as a preset down here. You can also, with reflector effects, you can target areas based on their luminance, chrominance as well. So that whether that's its brightness levels or its color. So you have those options down here in the slider as well. So again, extremely powerful tool. You can turn the effect on and off up here. I think I might have showed that, but just in case. And you can also check your levels. If you're clipping up here, you have clipping indicators here in the histogram. And you can see there's no clipping in the highlights. I've got a tiny, tiny bit of black clipping deep in the fur there. That's fine. I don't mind having something that's solid black in the image. Same around the eye of the cat here as well. There's a tiny little bit of black clipping. So those little clipping indicators are quite useful just to know that you haven't pushed it too far with any post-production that you might be doing. Let's go back and have a look. We're almost out of time, but let's go back and have a look at, just go back into all of the Nik filters again. I mentioned that you can have categories. You can hide categories here. You can turn them on and off. You can also create your own categories as well. And if I was, for example, happy with this, I would save this as a preset. We could call this reflector effects Palace Cat in snow. Save that as a preset. And then I do have the option to actually add that to a category up here. You can also search. So if you can't find a preset that you've created, I can just come up here, put in total contrast 0, and there's my preset that I created. And I can just apply that. Now, again, I've just applied that over the top. So I wiped out the effect that I did beforehand. So again, just keep that in mind. That's something to be aware of. It can be a little bit frustrating until you get used to that. If you are working with the histogram up here in Nik, you do have the option of looking at the individual channels. You can see in this particular image, all of those channels are very even. So we don't have a sunset image, for example, might show a lot more red in the highlights than this particular type of photograph. That can be a useful tool occasionally if you're working with sunset or sunrise images, just to know that it's there. I'm very much not a power user in Nik. I simply have a few tools like this that I use, tonal contrast being the main one, graduated fog also being occasional if I've got an image with fog. Reflector effects I find quite useful for putting some light onto wildlife. And if you are working with images, landscape images, for example, there is a very, very good filter in here that is quite useful. Filters called foliage. There it is. I'll just start so you can see it. This one here is quite useful for controlling greens. Now, in this particular image, it's not going to do much. We won't use it. But if you are working in landscape photographs, it's something that I frequently come in and have a look at. I find that the saturation that I get through this particular filter to be more natural and more realistic looking than what I get from simply increasing the saturation in Lightroom. So that's also something to be aware of. So let's just jump into a couple of these questions that have come up. One of them is, do I have a histogram showing with your viewfinder machine? I answered that one. Have you experimented with the linear profiles that some people publish in Lightroom? No, I haven't. I just haven't had the time, actually. My feeling in Lightroom with profiles is they can be an interesting starting point, but all bets are off when you start twiddling the dials. It's like a little bit like picture styles. If you shoot Canon cameras, you've got portrait, natural, neutral, landscape, etc. They all have a different look. But the moment you bring the image into Lightroom and start fiddling with dials, it doesn't really matter where you started. So I haven't had the time to check those, unfortunately. And there's another question there. Are they plugins in Photoshop? Yes, they are effectively a plugin, the Nik filters. Just think of them as a very sophisticated plugin, but you can access them, as I said, through Lightroom, and I believe you can actually access them directly as well. So there's multiple ways to get into Nik. I believe Nik also offer it's either a 7, 14, or 30-day trial. Apologies, I don't know. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, shape, or form, so I don't get a commission or kickback or anything like that if you do go and buy it. I just simply recommend that you at least try it because I find it's quite a powerful tool and very helpful, particularly for my type of style of imagery where I'm working a lot with snow and ice. There's a lot that can be brought out using things like tonal contrast that you can do in Photoshop and Lightroom, but it's much faster to do with Nik color effects. So that's why I use them. And I find that again, they're really best used as polishing tools at the end of the image. We'll just go back to Lightroom, and I'll just quickly check if there are any more questions. Um, okay, there's just a question about how does someone get in touch with me directly. Just email me. If you go to my website, jholko.com, so jholko.com, you'll find some contact details for me there. Just email me, and I can try and help you with that particular issue where you've got a photograph that you're not sure how to finish off properly. Okay, we have got a few minutes left, so let's just bring back Lightroom. So I'm working on two monitors here at the moment, one off to the side, so a little bit difficult. And have a look at one more image very quickly, where we've got a fox diving off a giant snowbank um, in Iceland. So again, this is a very similar type image in many ways, and it's a cross between the sort of the two fox images I've shown you, in that we have some distant mountains here on the left, and we have a fox fairly small in the frame, and we have a lot of snow and ice with a lot of fine textural detail in it. This is the type of raw file that really will benefit very significantly from this tonal contrast filter. So when you are working with images with snow and ice, pay attention to um, this sort of detail when you're photographing in the field, because this is what will help bring your images to life. By the way, it's been my experience too, also working with snow and ice, that not all cameras' sensors render it the same. Um, some years ago now, I forget how many years, maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, I had the 50 megapixel Canon. I think it was the EOS R, EOS 5R, I think it was, or something like that. Anyway, I took it down to Antarctica, and I really struggled with the way that sensor rendered snow and ice. I just couldn't get good texture and tone out of my raw files. When I went back to I think it was the original EOS 1DX, suddenly I had all this texture and tone back in my files. So just pay attention as well to your camera's sensor, because as I said, not all sensors render texture and tone, particularly in the highlights, in the same way. So that's just also something to be aware of. You can see it in raw file shots side by side. I'm fortunate to see that on workshops when I lead them, when I see people coming with all sorts of different cameras. And when we're looking at our raw files at the end of the day's shoot, it's amazing how different they are, not just in terms of composition and exposure, but in actually the way they render the snow and ice and the way it presents on the screen as well. Keeping in mind that, again, it's about trying to draw the viewer into the image and tell a powerful story. So I think that's probably about it from me on Nik. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to throw at me before we wrap up for the evening? If you do, you're welcome to pop them in the chat, or as I said, you're also welcome to contact me afterwards. And I'm very, very happy to take those as well. I just want to finish off and sum up with where I started, and that is really with the importance of operating on a color calibrated display. I am someone, as I said, who I do not like to work on my laptop. The only thing I'm doing on my laptop when I'm in the field is actually just importing and keywording my images. I'm not actually doing any post-production work until I get either back to my studio in Sweden or in Australia, where I've got a decent monitor and actually can see what's going on. And you can see this yourself. If you've got a laptop at home, put an image like this up on the screen that's got snow and ice, and if you tilt the screen back and forth, you will see the luminance values change. And that makes setting these tonal values almost impossible. So do yourself a favor. If you haven't got one, go out and have a look at a photo monitor. The ones by BenQ are fantastic value. And certainly their Palette Master Element software is the easiest I've used in terms of how you go about calibrating a display. It's very much plug and play. So, okay. Thanks very much, Jessica.
Thank you very much,
Great,
Joshua. It's
great,
really,
great to
really
be back here
insightful.
again.
Yeah, it's really insightful session we have. And thank you for also, I think like you already answered all of the questions, right? While you
I
are
think I
also
did.
like,
I think I caught them all, but if
yeah.
anyone has one, they're welcome to contact me.
Yeah, so it's like I think like the last one is from Mitchell Roberts. If you have a camera that does struggle with those fine details, are you better off exposing a little darker?
That's a very good question. And the answer to that is a maybe yes. I would do a little experiment with that and just see, okay, does underexposing by a third or half a stop actually help you in post-production? And if it does, then just make a mental note of it. And absolutely, it might cost you a third of a stop in noise, but these days with the denoise tools that we have available to us, I think it's better to do that and get texture and tone in the image here.
Okay, so thank you everyone for all of your time. Thank you, Joshua, as well. And
My pleasure.
maybe like a little bit recapping. So it's like if you really, really want to have a really good monitor like what Joshua has right now, you are very much welcome to visit our website. It's like thankyou.com, and you will find us like a professional photography monitor right there. So it's gonna be a really insightful sessions. And thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Joshua, as well. I wish everyone have a really good evening rest and see you in the next webinar. So
Thanks,
thank you,
Jessica.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye. Take care.
Bye bye. Take care.